welcome to this roundtable on lost in quantification, armed conflict databases and humanitarian practices. I'm very happy to welcome you and thank you very much, Rod, for this joint venture between two research programs dedicated to humanitarian issues and specifically to the role of big data in these issues. And I give the floor to Rod in order to introduce our panelists this morning. Rod.
Great. Thanks so much, Frederic, for the opening words. Just a little bit of introduction. Today we will have really amazing 5 panelists. And after their comments or what they want to share with us, we're going to come back to Frederic and to Luis, who will give us a little overview comments of what they just said. And then the idea is to open the floor for all of you. So take notes, prepare your words if you want to say something later on. And because we're already late, I won't say much at this point. With no further ado, I want to introduce you. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Francois. I never knew really how to pronounce it. Grunewald. Thanks. He's the executive director at URD. He's also an agricultural engineer and has a great deal of experience working on emergency food security programs. He also supervised, as part of his work as executive director, all group oral research and evaluation work. Moreover, he's also a board member of ISA, so he's also one of the host persons here in this table and this conference. Francois, pleasure having you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I just arrived this morning from Chad, an evaluation on the health programs, and data was a mess.
We cannot hear you anymore, Rod and colleagues on the floor. Maybe it's only me.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, now, okay. Yes, I can.
So if even in simple development programs, data can be a problem, then of course, what could it be in conflict zone where access, dangers, and even sensitivity of data is very high? Maybe a few things first. Why do we need data in conflict zone? We need data to characterize events with mortality, with impact of the conflict on the population, number of wounded, deaths, displacement. But are those data sufficient? How do they function? How do they work? Many years ago, a development specialist, maybe some of you have seen during the study, called Robert Chambers, identified a series of very interesting concepts. One of them was optimal ignorance. What do we really need to know? And in fact, if we look at a lot of the data collections, most of it ends up with data symmetries, very hardly used. Many of the data are not necessarily useful. So the Robert Chambers said we have to be very careful. Optimal ignorance is really what do we need to know. He came also with another very interesting concept, was what he called operational inaccuracy. Operational inaccuracy is what do we need to know now, because if we get it very precise later, it's of no use. So 80% right on time rather than 100% right too late. For action, of course, for research, it is another issue. He came also with very interesting concepts, and one of them has been redefined in his latest book. What kind of knowledge do we need? In fact, it is true. What kind of knowledge do we need? Do we need data? But data is just hardly a knowledge, an operational knowledge. We need knowledge. We need more of that. We need understanding of situation. And data is just one of the elements that can bring us to that can bring us to understand why are people moving in that quantity to that direction during a conflict. What kind of wounds do we see, bullets or others, and how does that link to the military strategy of the armed forces, etc. So we need to have data always linked to what type of knowledge, what type of understanding we want. Very often, I can tell you, it's not. Very often we collect a lot of data. We have people with a Kubo toolbox in the field collecting data, sometimes not realizing that people are laughing around them because they don't look at them anymore. Now we are so sophisticated with our data collection system. So we are doing data, and we don't have anymore this eyes-to-eyes contact with people that help us to see whether the data has any meaning, whether people are telling us kind of truth or not. So we lose that, which has a big impact on the quality of data. Maybe a few last elements, because I think it's good we have time for discussion. First on data management. Managing data is a science, it's statistic with a big S. Most of the time we see what I would call in French bidouillage statistique. People who have no knowledge of the science of statistics, and they are just using pre-made programs to enter data and to treat the data. They are sometimes using data which have been designed in the model of a Gaussian curve, while in fact the real frequency analysis is a flat curve, multimodal curve, where the Gaussian curves and the related tools, average, etc., have no meaning. So most of the time, people don't know what it means. And it's very interesting and it's very worrying because it comes to very prominent data provider like the FSMAU in Nairobi, the food security unit, which is funded by millions of euros over the last years. And in 2006, I pointed out in one of the publications one thing, and I saw it again in 2019. It is approximately, we see approximately 927,35 people in risk of dying. It's either approximately, or it is 800 to 2696, precise number. But they put approximately that number. So I asked them, how did you calculate that? Well, he said, we went to those war zones affected in Somalia. We took 2 villages, 2 settlements, and then we made the survey, and we extrapolated that on the global population. I said, do you know the global population? They say, well, we have been using the census of 1964, and we are adding a multiplier of growth. I told them, do you know all the story of this census? Everybody say it is a political crap organized by Siad Barre to organize this clanic manipulation. And in terms of the growth, do you know how many people are still in Hodur? How people have left Hodur? We are in a nomadic area where people are moving all the time. So a number of 3 villages extrapolated on the data, on a number known by at least 20% margin of error, and it becomes approximately 826,937. So and published in a EU-sponsored, FAO-supported, WFP-supported publication, systematically since 2006. So data is often something that is used to satisfy donors, to make nice camembert, nice graph. Most of the time, people don't know what they talk about when they use data. I will probably stop here by one joke. I used in a similar panel in Washington, DC a couple of years ago. It was in the big USAID conference room. And I explained that statistics are like bikinis. It's not what they show, which is interesting, is what they hide. Big silence in the room and everybody starts laughing. People realize that in fact, data can be so manipulated that if we don't have a very highly strong code of ethics to use them, and more than that, if we have a very strong capacity of the people to use them properly, to treat them properly, to analyze them properly, then it's a mess. Just to finish, data looks at the past. Probably our biggest problem now is not the past, it's the future. And their data can be used only to do scenarios, extremely useful. So, but it's projection, it's not anymore accurate. It's what the data would show us if pushed to the limit. In a world of complexity, in a world of uncertainty, data should not be seen as the next plus ultra. Data is just one of the small elements in our toolbox, but knowledge, understanding, dialogue is probably more important than data. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Francois. I think that's a really good starting point to our roundtable, with an understanding how complex it is to understand data. You know, it's not just simply collect data. We need to be critical about it. We need to be reflective about it. But I'm also really happy to welcome here Christina Ville, who is actually working. She's the director of Insecurity Insight, but she's also the founder of the Aid in Danger project, but also the Security Numbers database. So she's also bring the experience of people already trying to collect data. The SAND, or the Security Number database, is quite interesting if you haven't seen it before, because it's an event-based database that brings information from different sources. Maybe Christina will say more about it. Really important for us also to know, for you to know, that Christina's work, or her work, is basing on the data use for improving and developing of human security, with a particular focus on the monitoring and evaluation of humanitarian information generation. So quite useful for us today. So Christina, it's an honor to have you here. Welcome, and the floor is yours, or the screen.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I hope that technology won't fail us. Yes, I'm extremely pleased to be here. In many respects, I felt for a moment I don't have to say anything because Francois has said it all. But what I think I will be concentrating on with my talk now is to give you very concrete examples from the work we are doing with the databases that Rod just mentioned. And I think you will find that this will highlight a lot of the points that I think Francois made so clearly just now. Data and knowledge, and also the question of past and future, and how good does the data have to be that we can do anything with it. So before I start, maybe a few words on the databases I run, because I think, as Rod said, not many people know it. And one of the reasons for that is that it contains a lot of confidential information, so we can't sort of give it straight out. But that said, we do collaborate with academics and others who have a legitimate interest. So if that's something you wanted to discuss later, I'd be happy to talk more to you about it. So what is this database, this Aid in Danger? We are covering, it's an event database, and we are covering events that interfere with the delivery of aid. And for that, it focuses on violence and threats against aid workers, aid operations, but also on key programs such as health, education, protection, and also sexual violence and conflict. And the information we collect comes from three main sources. We have an ongoing scanning of media and increasingly social media for reported incidents from a variety of people. We then have partnerships with some 38 agencies who submit us their confidential incidents on a regular basis, which we then bring in the same sort of standard and have it in the database. And then we collaborate with a number of conflict databases and other relevant databases, ACLED, for example, but also the World Health Organization's surveillance system on attacks on healthcare, and extract key events that are relevant for what we are doing from those databases. So what I wanted to focus on here was really the use of this data in the humanitarian field and how do practitioners use it, because we really developed this database to support the humanitarian sector rather than to be an academic project. So the first thing to say here is that aid agencies use the data, the trend data, on very specific events, such as aid workers killed or kidnapped, for their broad policy. This is now standard in board meetings in aid agencies, in annual reports, and other sort of quite big picture publications. No agency would not make reference to such trends, both globally and affecting their own aid agency. And there's also increasing use of this event data for practical issues such as insurances, for example, and for that it matters how many vehicles are hijacked, for example, or what the asset loss is from violence. So this is also how it's practically used. But then there is this really complicated area of aid agency security risk management. And this is a concept that focuses on acceptance. Aid agencies need to have a policy that makes sure their activity is accepted and wanted in the area they are and the people they work with and around with. And the acceptance idea is if they explain well what they're doing, then they should be protected because everyone should understand why their work is important. But acceptance doesn't work in all contexts. So there's also the element of protection. That means you have to have security protocols of how people react and respond and protect themselves. And then finally, there is the concept of deterrence. That would mean you have armed guards, you use armored vehicles, you travel around in protected convoys. So it's these sort of three elements. And within all of these elements, there's all sorts of daily decisions that aid agencies have to take in terms of what to do to protect their staff, their assets, their operations, their access to beneficiaries. And I think here, the issue that Françoise mentioned, sort of data and knowledge, becomes really important. Because for this, the data that's in the past, as Françoise also said, is not very useful for planning the future and your responses. And the way this is addressed by aid agencies is that they think about prediction, what is likely to come, and what mitigation measures do we need to put in place to protect our staff, our assets, our ability to operate. And for that reason, we have, as this incident database, have now partnered with a group of analysts that very much focus on doing exactly that sort of prediction and mitigation. And the use of information is really quite interesting in this sense, because the faster we have to be, the more we're just relying on qualitative information. Inserting the data trends into this analysis usually slows us down by 3-4 weeks or so, and that can already be too late. So that's sort of one, but we do try to do it later. And if you're interested, I'm happy to share some of these examples. But I think it sort of really highlights the difficulty of bringing data and knowledge together. How much do you need for quick decisions, and how fast can you produce that? And then before I stop, I just also wanted to share a couple of thoughts on the relationship between quantitative and qualitative data for what we may refer to as the impact research. So this is work that tries to understand what the consequence of the violence is on the aid operations, but also on the access to the particular services that are provided. So specifically, if we're looking at violence against healthcare, what is the connection between the incidence of violence against either doctors, nurses, or health facilities, and the health indicators within a country, or the overall access to health and health well-being of a population? And for this, we are collaborating with an academic research network called RIA, the Researching the Impact of Attacks on Healthcare. And I just had a message that one of my colleagues is listening to this. So yeah, there may also be interesting contributions from the floor on this. Just sort of two key findings from that work that I think might be interesting for the discussions here. So the first is that the quantitative data, so the event data we have on this violence on healthcare, is incredibly incomplete. There are a lot of networks collecting this data. And in a place like Afghanistan, for example, there's UNAMA, there's the World Health Organization, there's the Health Cluster, there is the International NGO Safety Organization. There are many actors. But when we look at this data in detail, we see that each actor has its own sources of information. And that is because people only report incidents when they trust who they report to, or when they feel there is a purpose to it because something will happen. And it is only within these networks that people report. So we'll find that there are multiple parallel reporting systems, and the overlap for Afghanistan, we think, is about 20%. So the information isn't brought together at the moment. And I could give you other examples from the DRC during the Ebola response, where there were various incidents that came through the network of the World Health Organization, but this was only from the organizations linked to internationally funded projects, and health services that were outside of these, quite often run by churches, were not recorded in that WHO system. So that's one point. The qualitative data, although we think there is a lot, actually needs a lot of attention. And then the final point I'm linking to this, which also sort of brings us back to the question of past and future and how we think and use information. There's been a very interesting study done on Nepal and the conflict, and how violence was remembered there in using some oral history techniques to discuss this. And it was really interesting to see that people's recalling of events that occurred in the past is actually not very accurate, and it's very difficult to make sense of that. So as this sort of concluding point I would make from that is that it is really important that we do an ongoing monitoring and recording of whatever happens, and then later take this into a more critical assessment, both in terms of how does that link to the networks where this is coming from, and how does that link to people's experiences and understanding and the overall impact. But so the bottom line is there, I think data is not a one point in time thing in the use of conflict and humanitarian settings, but it's something we have to think of somewhat dynamically, and also really have to think between data and knowledge, the understanding and the interpretation of it. Without that, we can get to very misleading results. So I stop here and I look forward to more discussions on this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christina, also for introducing us to your database that, as you said, is collecting data that many times is confidential, it's difficult to get for many. So it's really playing an important role. So it's really important that you share this with us, and also we know more about how you do it. Thanks so much for that. And we are moving to, I would say, a completely different realm. We are moving now for a website that actually put a lot of data completely publicly. You can always get information from it. And that's the UN OCHA datasets called HDX, for you to know, the Humanitarian Data Exchange. And to know more about it, we have no more and no less than Mr. Javier Terán, who is a statistician at OCHA, but is also particularly a member and coordinating a lot of the work in the HDX database. For those who doesn't know, it's an open platform for sharing humanitarian data, but also for us, researching humanitarian action is incredible because it's one of the first big initiatives where you can find all data sets from all the different organizations in one single place. So you can find information per country, per region, but also they are developing a lot of really nice infographics that make sometimes your life quite easy, because as François was saying, sometimes not everyone has the capability to analyze data properly. And when others systematize it for you in a proper way with people like Javier behind, it's really a big advance in our work. So Javier, thanks so much for being with us. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Rod, and thank you, Frederick, for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here with all of you, and also with the colleagues in this panel. I have some slides. I don't know if you can see them through the screen.
Yes, quite well.
Just to guide a little bit the discussion. So what I'm going to be talking about is about XDX. This initiative by OCHA, one of the initiatives of the Center for Humanitarian Data to make data available. The Center for Humanitarian Data is also working on other work streams, including data literacy, predictive analytics, and also data responsibility. But what I want to focus today is on the work on data availability. So as you probably know, the OCHA has been always playing an important role on information management. So very much in line with our mandate of coordination, our work on data is very much focusing on data aggregation. While other UN organizations like IOM or UNHCR or NGOs like ACLED or IPC, they collect sector-specific data like refugees or IDPs or food prices of conflict events. Our work is to make all these data, put this data together to draw a more holistic, a more complete view of a humanitarian crisis. So the challenge that XDX wants to address is to find this data, this humanitarian data that, as Francois and Christina have been commenting, is not easy to find. And whenever it was found, we realized that that data was very difficult to use. Issues with what is the source of this data set? Is it the latest data set? What is the methodology that was used to collect this data? Is it the latest one? So all these issues were very hard to find, and getting this information was in the past very much based on personal connection. So if you knew the IMO in Afghanistan, who was very much aware of the data about conflict events, you will get it. But if you didn't have that connection, that was very hard. So XDX is trying to address that issue, and that was kind of the inception of XDX. So this is just a screenshot of the platform that you can find on that website. And it was launched in 2014. And the goal of the platform is really to make data easy to find and use for analysis. At this moment, there are hundreds of organizations sharing data on the platform. And the data that they are on the platform on XDX are covering every crisis from Afghanistan to Yemen. There are approximately 18,000 data sets from organizations that have been contributing to the platform, from MDAT, Insecurity Insights, of course, Education and Conflict Monitor, the Observatory of Conflict and Violence Prevention, and of course, many UN organizations that they share data on regular basis, UNICEF, IOM, UNHCR. So I invite you to come to this site to look for the information that is on XDX. So just to give you a little more on the type of data set that you can find on the platform. So on XDX, you can find data sets about the context of a crisis. So that means the administrative boundaries, the population statistics, the damage assessments, baseline information. But also you can find data about the people affected. So the number of people in need, the number of IDPs, the refugees, people affected, people being reached, conflict events, attacks on healthcare, attacks on health education, and then the other component of our humanitarian data on XDX is data about the response. So who is doing what where, this typical product that OCHA produces, what is IUM doing in certain areas. The DTMs are available on XDX. So 18,000 data sets openly available for you to download and to look at them. So of course, we believe that we can make efficiency in the system, because now you don't need to go anymore look for the IMO in certain areas. You can just come to XDX and look for the data that you're looking for. Every data set on the platform comes with a strong component of metadata. So I'm one of the believers that metadata is super important for our sector. And on the metadata, you can find the information of where this data is coming from, what is the validity of the data, what's the methodology used to collect this data, whether or not there are some caveats or comments related to the information. But even though our community have made a lot of effort to make data available, we know that there are significant gaps on the humanitarian sector. So to create awareness of the data that is available on our sector, but also to point at those data gaps, we have created what we call the XDX data grids. The data grid is nothing else but just a way to show the most important crisis data in one single view. So the data grids puts together data sets from 6 categories: affected people, coordination, geography, health and education, in 21 categories. And 3 of those categories are very much relevant for this discussion, because we are looking for data about conflict events, affected areas, and humanitarian access. And we are looking at specifically at 21 different countries, which are the countries where they have an interagency response plan if there is a humanitarian crisis. So the analysis of these data grids triggers an annual report that we produce at the end of December, the first days of January, just to show what is the status. And I think with the talk of Francois and Christine, so far, it's not a surprise that just 50% of the data that we believe is essential for a humanitarian response is available. 50% is complete, 50% is either incomplete or missing. There are huge data gaps. So here, just sharing that for you. But the team continues looking for data, looking to develop new partnerships, trying to push more data sets to the platform, trying to fill those data gaps. And we have been also exploring some other innovative practices. And for instance, this is a collaboration that the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, together with the Education Above All Foundation and the Qatar Computer Research Institute, put together, which illustrates the analysis of conflict events, attacks on education, read from ACLED, but also read by tweets in Africa and the Middle East. So what we have done with the colleagues at the Qatar Computer Research Institute is to train a machine to read about 10 million of tweets and identify mentions of attacks on education. So as you can imagine, on Twitter, it's a lot of stuff there. And it's not surprised that about only 5% of those 10 millions were really relevant for this exercise. Many of them, they use some slang that they were referring to attacks and education, but were not really significant. And some other tweets, they didn't have location information, so it was really hard to map them. But all in all, we found that there's a lot of opportunity on this. There was like a 70% of precision between what we could read from Twitter and what ACLED was reporting. And as all these machine learning instruments and algorithms, it's just about time that the algorithm learns and little by little improves their capability to recognize the relevant tweets. So just leaving that in case we want to discuss also some uses of big data. And just to finalize, another challenge that we face on XDX is just to ensure that sensitive and personal data is not exposed on the platform. And especially with conflict data, whenever there are some very granular data set, we have to be very careful that no sensitive data is exposed. And as we always know, trust is hard to gain, but very easy to lose. So we are really doing a lot of effort to build this trust and supporting data responsibility with it OCHA XDX, but also with our community. And with those words, I just finish and stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Javier. I always enjoy seeing you presenting. It's not the first time because it's super clear and easy to follow and understand really what you are doing. So thanks for that again. Now we're moving to another point of view, that it's people providing data for others or supporting others. And particularly, I'm talking about the Data for Peace and Security Consultancy Group. We have here Bas Bilsma. I hope so that we have here. Do we have here?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Sorry, yeah. And we lost you on the other screen. That's why I was great. So he's the general, he's the founder of the Data for Peace and Security Consultancy. But not only that, he has more than over 11 years of experience informing peace building, international development, but also key decision-making processes in the Global South and Global North. He has worked in various complex environments, but also, and I think I came across in your name, mainly when you were working at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he also co-authored the Integrated International Security Strategy. So, Bas, pleasure having you here. Please, welcome.
Thanks for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here also together with these amazing panelists. Good morning from Amsterdam. So what I will try to do is provide a bit of a practitioner's perspective, and I brought some slides. I hope that you can see them. I will build on my own experience as a consultant for a number of clients, international organizations, international NGOs, but also on my work when I was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where I was working on early warning and risk analysis for conflict prevention and transforming that into preventive action. So I will start with some cool examples and maybe one less cool but nevertheless relevant example from how data and new technologies are being used in practice to build peace, to protect civilians in dangerous places, and to increase our international security. And one is a tool that was developed by Hela, and basically this was two guys who were really concerned about what was going on in Syria, where you had the civilians, leaving them extremely vulnerable and killing many people. And they decided that the least they could do is enable these civilians to be warned when there were upcoming airstrikes. So what did they do? They developed a network of audio sensors which could detect fighter jets taking off and flying over in the direction to which they were flying. And they combined that also with a network of human sensors, aka regular people who were recording real-time fighter jets taking off from Air Force bases, for example, or flying over their homes. With this input, they built a database registering where they saw the actual bombings, developed an algorithm that learned from that to predict where, in real time, where fighter jets were likely to drop their bombs. Since, of course, it was the government bombing their own civilians, the airstrike alarm wasn't functioning. So what did they do? They generated alerts through social media once they detected fighter jets in the air and had a prediction of where they were likely to start bombing people. And this is, I think, a very interesting example of where you see how tech is helping people, even in difficult conflict environments, and where they were using basically sort of old school observations by people, combining it with more advanced sort of audio sensors, and feeding into a predictive algorithm that was actually able to generate concrete action, namely sending out an alert, a warning for an airstrike. So another example is developed by a Dutch NGO, SNV, in the Sahel region, where they developed a tool together with a mobile phone provider to inform pastoralists about some key information relevant for them and their livelihoods, and also with the purpose to avoid local conflicts with local farmers. As you likely know, there are many of those local conflicts where pastoralists and farmers are competing for land, where herds are eating farmers' crops, and those local conflicts can turn really, really violent really quickly. So what they did, basically, they built a sort of a navigation tool, which you and I are probably using often in our cars, guiding pastoralists and their herds to fertile grazing grounds with real-time information, but also recently experimenting with adding conflict data, for example, from the ECLAT database that has been mentioned already, allowing also pastoralists sort of to navigate around local conflicts and ensuring a safer passage. So then maybe a little bit more boring example, but nevertheless this is what the largest chunk of my work as a consultant focuses on. How can you sort of make policy making processes and procedures on peace building and generating more action for conflict prevention? How can you make this more data driven? And here I sort of show a sort of a basic cycle of these policy making procedures. I won't go into detail. If you have questions about it, ask me later. But here you see that there's an interesting mix of types of data in different phases of the policymaking process. So usually it starts with an early warning scan for conflict risks, which is quite basic, using country level statistics, for example, open source information, developing sort of a first index of, for example, countries at risk of violent conflict. And then in the next phases of the early warning section, you see sort of a prioritization going on. And there you see, for example, qualitative data or insights, expert knowledge being inserted in the process, but also other qualitative data sources, such as, of course, reports from international NGOs or from the UN, or qualitative assessments by the crisis group for specific countries. And these are used to sort of to get a sort of a short list of, for example, countries at risk of violent conflict, for which you can develop sort of preventive targeted policies. And one interesting thing, the shortlisting phase, in my experience, is always really messy. And there have been countless initiatives to quantify this process, to make it more objective. But often this is really characterized by really subjective analysis. For example, on specific interests for the organization making the prioritization. For example, on the economic impacts of conflict. And there you see also some interesting initiatives trying to quantify the potential impacts of violent conflict. So to quantify sort of the financial cost and the human costs were an early warning to escalate and to escalate into violent conflict. And I really noticed, as a diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also now working with many clients, that sometimes you can have really good qualitative assessments by best experts, but if you have, for example, a right-wing minister who isn't really as much engaged with those kind of issues, then, for example, with economic interests, national economic interests, these quantifications can really help to also engage those folks to act and to invest in conflict prevention. So I leave it at this for this example, but if you have questions on this, please reach out to me later. So basically, what data, new technologies, including big data analytics, can do for peace building and conflict prevention is enriching insights, enhancing impact, and also increasing the engagement of relevant stakeholders. And I think moving from the old school to the sort of the new school innovative way of working has many advantages. I'll name some. So what I see is it allows us to move from more static analysis, static policy making towards more dynamic, real-time analysis. It enables us to integrate different types of data sources, but also time and space, as Javier, I think, showed a nice example of this with this map, combined with a time lapse, where you clearly see trends over time visualized in space. So, and these are, I think, these are also examples that work really well with high-level politicians and decision makers who don't understand all these complex data analytics and sometimes maybe even be afraid of that. So are we lost in quantification? So I think there's 4 gaps that in my work I usually try to, or help also clients to bridge, right? So one is the promises of and the potential of advanced analytics and their configuration with sort of the old school policy making processes, right? Often the advanced data-driven tools don't match sort of the standard ways of working for government officials or NGO employees, and bridging that, targeting the data tools more towards the policy making processes and the other way around, enabling governments and others to be more flexible to absorb those data-driven insights and tools is something where we really need to take some more steps to mainstream this. The other gap is sort of the data savviness, the data savvy folks versus the tech illiterate folks. And maybe I already mentioned people who are also a little bit afraid of using new technologies, sometimes because they don't understand what they are, but also sometimes because there are really valid worries there, because we see international actors, governments, or government-related actors using technologies and new technologies as weapons, or exploiting gaps in other people's technologies for their own advantages. So a third gap that I see is that, you know, like we in the innovation world, we get really enthusiastic about everything that's possible, right? But there's a downside to this, and that's that we tend to overpromise what's possible, sort of sketch a holy grail, right? And then in reality, it's always more difficult. It takes more time and more resources, right? So I think there we need to be careful to not overpromise and underdeliver. And so this leads me to the final sort of gap or challenge, where sometimes we are lost in quantification, and that is the balance between the endless possibilities out there and the lack of resources. And that's why I really liked Francois's mentioning of the optimal ignorance. And I think this is really key, because we are easily drowning in data, and we need to focus more on specific use cases driven by people who will be using the output from new data and new technologies in their work to focus the resources where they have the largest impact. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please raise them or contact me via my email address that's on the screen. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the rest of this roundtable.
Thanks so much, Bas. That was really clear also. I really enjoyed the 4 final gaps, so probably there will be a lot of discussion about it later. Our final guest is Emmanuel Baron. Maybe many of you know him already. He is since 2008 the General Director of the Epicenter. Emmanuel is also a general practitioner and spent several years working with Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, in the field, but also at its headquarters. For the ones who don't know, Epicenter is an MSF Epidemiological Research Division. It's an MSF research center, and a really old one, if I'm not mistaken, I think from mid-80s at least. And it has really a lot of good information. What I really appreciate from Epicenter is that information, sometimes epidemiological information, can be really complex and dry to get. And what I like that their reports are sometimes, many times, really easy, and they're already translating information to people who doesn't know anything about it. I use a lot of your report when I was studying the Ebola response in Sierra Leone, and it was really good to get proper epistemological research, databases and information, but in a way that was understandable for everyone. So, Emmanuel, the screen is yours. Thanks so much for being with us.
Voilà, much better. No, I thank you. I thank you so much also for for your kind words, for inviting me, and indeed it's very, very great to talk after my colleagues from the panel. In their presentation, I found a lot of things in common with what we're doing. First,
Well,
I would like to. Can you hear me well? Sorry.
Oh, we can hear you super loud. So is it low, not loud?
No.
No, all the way around. Is it possible that you get closer? We're also trying to.
You want me to let me know? Is it
Our side, we can also.
Is it better? Is it better now?
Yeah, it's a bit better. Thanks so much.
It's better. Yeah, it seems my colleagues hear me well, if I'm right. Well, just the essential. Sorry. So I would like to. I thanked all of you for this invitation. It's not a discussion. I wanted to know if in the audience there was a member of the French government, because if it was the case, then I would tell this person that yes, unlike what is said on the public channels, we can discuss about numbers. I'm saying that because you know that today with COVID and the need for more vaccination, there is an incredible advert on TV which about COVID says in French, on peut débattre de tout sauf des chiffres. We can discuss everything but the numbers. I find it absolutely astonishing. So I'm happy that in Paris today, we're discussing numbers, despite what is said publicly everywhere in this country. So having said that, I wanted to tell you, give you a brief overview of some points of our practice. As you said, we are the epidemiological arm of MSF and work in the settings where MSF works. And therefore we try to count death rates, nutritional status, vaccination coverage, access to healthcare, and other figures within the programs which are needed. We do that through surveys, for surveillance, and more now we establish some dashboards for the people in charge in MSF. By the way, we use more and more also the mixed method. I think it's Christina, we mentioned that, and definitely for us now, more and more we have requests from MSF about quantitative but also qualitative figures, which is quite interesting and very interesting trend those last 2-3 years. One of the principles we have, and I want to mention, is that therefore we work in conflict area definitely, but we will never take as much risk to collect data as we would for a care activity. It's clear, care comes first at MSF and data collection comes second. It's an important principle to keep in mind, even today. So when I think of data in conflict, of course, whether descriptive or analytical, more analytical, the first 2 points which were somehow mentioned earlier is the rationale behind the data collection and the objective, and then afterwards come the question of which method we're going to apply. About the first point, the question of the objective, it was mentioned earlier as well, and I think Francois made the point also in his introduction. There is no pure data. There is a clear link between what you measure and or what you want to show, and from what you want to show, between what you want to show and what you want and how you want to interpret it. This is, I think, Francois, you mentioned something about understanding our data. It's absolutely clear. And in this case, the conflicts, by the way, are not specific. There is nothing specific to conflict. For the prevalence of a disease, the underlying, estimating the prevalence of a disease in a country or in an area, the underlying question remains the same. So for us, in general, our objective is twofold. Either it's what we call operational or for advocacy. Operational, as you can understand, it's for the MSF teams, how to better drive their project, knowing what's the population size, how many vulnerable children, for example, which health structure do they have access to, what is their health status, the death rate, the causes of death, of course. And it can be also, as I said, for communication. But coming back to the use for operation, my fear today is that I feel that more and more the data replaces the curiosity or the common sense of some people in the field. I think that in our societies in general, data count a lot. You see a lot of figures. See with the COVID pandemic, how many dashboards you had access to and how many journals were published and still continue to publish data in the different forms. I think that this general trend is also very present within the MSF teams, where not much can be done without data. I refer to what Christina said about the need for qualitative information, and I have a tendency to reinforce this point, because when I talk with my colleagues, because I think that actually, as you know very well, there are a lot of caveats to data. There's also caveats definitely when you talk to people, when you try to gather information by yourself through events, through discussion, my curiosity. I have the feeling that more and more the MSF teams tend to rely a lot, trust us quite blindly, and rely a lot on us. We are an independent body and within MSF, and the trust is actually quite impressive today. But at the same time, well, this is nice, but at the same time, we also do some training, in charge some training within MSF, and we teach also people to criticize data and to assess themselves properly the quality of the information they get. Actually, it's very funny. It's also the same as, you know, in medical schools today. People learn, are trained to read even the Lancet or any other big journals, and to have an eye on that. To come to the second point, second objective, general objective, advocacy, to alert, to mobilize, or to denounce. You probably saw some good examples about the Rohingya in 2017, the survey we did, estimating a death toll of about 7,000 people killed in August and September in the Rakhine state in Myanmar. Or there is also a bit earlier in 2014 this example that came out in the media about in Central African Republic, where the Muslim population had to flee to Chad and even to Cameroon, and we also had an estimation of a bit less than 3,000 deaths during this displacement. About this example, and I would like to use this example of CAR to mention something internal that happened. In the report we wrote our internal report, even internal presentations within the organization. We never mentioned actually the reason why those people had to flee and were killed. It was obvious for all of us, but we never mentioned that those people were threatened because they were Muslims. So there was, we corrected that in the report and in the public communication, but even in our scientific day, when we presented the result of this survey to the whole movement, to our colleagues, it did not appear as a point, whereas that was the trigger for this violence. Being Muslim was just not one variable among others, such as age, height, weight, or whatever, or education, or all that we collect in general. And what I want to mention with this example is that not only we have to count properly, but we also have to name properly what we measure. It has remained for me a good example of how we can be with a good objective, with a good method, but a poor interpretation. I'm very harsh towards ourselves. We knew it, and we were not ignorant, and we work in a group where our colleagues participate. But actually, that's an example that I keep in mind because it's quite important. So after those points about the objective, one point about the method, I don't want to be long about that. Of course, you know very well that method can lead to serious misinterpretation. We have biases on classification of death that regularly comes back. For example, how do we classify the loss to follow up? In general, we tend to be very conservative in our estimates, but it's also a decision to be made about that, and it generates a lot of discussion. The question come up sometimes about sampling, of course, and while you know very well the examples of the survey done that led to serious controversy done in 2004, 2006, 2004, 2006 in Iraq with the teams of Les Roberts. with less controversy, but also interesting discussion inside MSF on the survey we did in Maiduguri, the Borno state of Nigeria, where counting the number of deaths in an area was really challenging, and we had to select the study area with great care, and interpretation was not that easy as well. Voilà. So there are, I don't want to be too long about the question of the method, and there are colleagues of mine who would be much better to tell you more about that. To finish my point, two short things. The first, there are areas where we fail to estimate any events. There are situations where it's absolutely not possible to say anything because we can't have access. We do not have access because it can be too dangerous or just really impossible, physically impossible. The migrants in the Sahel is a situation where we've been very poor in trying to estimate any magnitude. Same rate in Borno, outside of the camps. There were areas in Borno that remained completely and where the situation was unknown to anyone. There was absolutely no independent and external eye on what was going on in those areas, never. And we are basically blind in those settings. And I want to, it's just a way to say that we can have some nice work, you can do some nice work, get some success or whatever, but there are also areas where we just fail. And the last thing also to temper a bit the excitement of many on data, and it's an epidemiologist would tell you that, is that despite the intrinsic strength of numbers, an epidemiologist may not be always the best person to influence political or policy decisions in order to raise awareness about the situation of the group of our population. Human rights organizations, journalists, or even photographers can mobilize in a much better way than epidemiology can do, even in the absence of formal data. Voilà. Briefly said what I wanted to share with you this morning, and I'm more than happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel. Thank you for all the speakers also to be on time. That's really, really useful for me as a chair. That's been amazing. I want to give the floor now to Frederic. I'm terrible in pronouncing your name in French. I always pronounce it in the German or Spanish way. Luis, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
very briefly. Thank you very much for sharing us your experiences and your presentations. I only want to put on the table two paths, and of course, Luis will put on the table other comments. First of all, data are always for someone and for doing something, and like a theory. When Robert Cox, the IR scholar, said a theory is always for something and for doing something and for someone. And we need more reflexivity, especially to recognize the data gap and the dynamic conception. And I would like to know how to implement a dynamic conception between data and knowledge. From the old school to a more innovative perspective, if I use the BAS categories he used, what spaces we need to set up some links, some bridges between practitioners and some scholars. And the second path is the nexus between academics and practitioners. Many of you select academic databases in your own tools, but what are the criteria you used for selecting them? And do you think that you can imagine strong cooperation for co-construct these databases, or is it totally impossible according to you? So how to imagine more links between academics and you when you set up such databases? And I will stop there because Liz, I'm sure you have many things to share with us.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, nice. Yes, because as a member of the DataWeb project, I'm doing some research on the relationship between humanitarian workers and quantitative data. And I think two main dynamics may have underlined our discussion this morning. First, that, and as Frédéric just said, there isn't a big use of academic databases, right, by humanitarian workers, except for ACLED. And it's interesting because it can be related to what Larissa Fast has called the divide between those working in conflict and those working on conflict. And requirements on data are not the same because, as we saw today, humanitarian workers need very operational data that are local data and fresh data with what we call inappropriate accuracy. And this is not often appropriate inaccuracy. And it is not often the case with databases, except for ACLED, because it's an event related database. And second, another dynamic, and I would be interested in having your thoughts on it, is that I found out that the relationship between humanitarian workers and quantitative data is much more confused than it is promoted. And that is the question of knowledge production that we raised today is not as straightforward as promoted by the evidence-based humanitarianism. And I think I've managed to find three reasons maybe. So first, that humanitarian workers are not really trained to use data, except when they are related to needs. And it nurtures, I think, a bottom-up accountability towards donors and decision makers rather than day-to-day project management. And second, there is also a certain resistance to quantitative data in the humanitarian field as part of maybe a broader resistance or fear, as Bas told us, of technology. And finally, I found also that there is a lot of criticism of the way the data is collected in the humanitarian field and of the need-based system. So it complicates the relationships between humanitarian workers and quantitative data. So I would be glad to have your thoughts on this, and the floor is open for discussion.
Or maybe to collect other questions and comments before coming back to the panel.
Yeah, okay.
So maybe someone else here want to, please.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting roundtable. I'm actually working closely with
Maybe, yeah.
to come back to the microphone. All right. Thank you very much for a very interesting roundtable. I'm actually working with Christina and Larissa Fast on some of these issues of data collection. And I just wanted to make one point and two questions. The first point is that data collection generates the measurable reality, and that in effect means that there's an epistemological problem potentially at the heart of it. And the study that that the Nepalese conflict shows that certain type of data was collected in a certain framework, but not, for example, attacks on healthcare, because that wasn't part of the framework. It was attacks on human rights was picked up, but not attacks on healthcare, which meant that the measurable reality wasn't picked up. And that impacts a lot, because we realized that the unreported events, frequent but low intensity, had a great impact on mental health and the delivery of healthcare. So that's one point to make. The second point I wanted, and this is a question, was actually about overpromising. And I'm turning to Bas. You showed us an interesting data set of pastoral, supposed to show pastoralists how to navigate conflict zones and avoid conflicts with sedentary folks. And I thought that was a puzzling example of not overpromising something, and also asking myself, what were the ethics of putting responsibility on potential victims of conflict? to avoid the conflict zone. I've got a slight anxiety about that project. I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about it if you can. And finally, yeah, no, I think these are my 2 points. I'll stop there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Other questions to collect? Please, Eric.
Yeah, yeah, I'm Eric Sang. I'm also a member of the Data War project, and I thank you very much for all those really fascinating presentations and talks. And I just wanted to throw in perhaps two things that that we also noticed in earlier conversations with practitioners and conflict analysts. And the first thing I wanted to throw in was the role of conflict theory. So I noticed that in the slide by Bess, you have somewhere in the kind of conflict prevention area that there is a place for conflict theory. So how do you theorize the links between, for example, different data that you collect? But generally, I think we noticed that the role of theory is not so much discussed among practitioners. So is this something that in your organizations that you have a discussion, you know, how do we imagine, for example, we had this example of educational security. How do you imagine is the relationship between educational insecurity and how it can be measured? Do you have a model on how this, for example, can be measured through Twitter feeds? And the second observation I wanted to throw in is, you know, now that there are more and more people and agencies collecting data and to some extent offering them to other actors, is there something like a market with market dynamics? So is there a competition between data providers, data analysts? Is there pressure also to be faster with published data than the others? Is this something that you can feel, that you can observe in your field, or do you say this is perhaps too early to tell, or it's not as mature as other fields of humanitarian action? Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, we have already someone who wants to step in to start replying or giving back to the comments.
Yeah, maybe a few elements on some of the questions. I think being concerned about data and being concerned about and being techno-reluctant is not the same. I think we have to be very careful. The accusation of they don't want quantitative data because they are old school, or they don't like those high tech. I think it's a wrong fight. Just one example. Some of the most interesting evidence that have been produced recently on conflict have been produced by people who are high-tech geek, analyzing data on Twitter, on Facebook, and YouTube, mapping conflict, identifying where are mass graves by using all kind of technology and monitoring on those. It's high-tech, absolutely high-tech. And it's great, it gives incredible results. And I'm very happy to see that. The fact that I'm very concerned about the quality of some of the data collection tools. I mean, we all know the debate about Facebook and these algorithms who are manipulating all of us because one day you have look at 2 pages on I want to buy ecological cheese, and the following day, whatever you open in Facebook is all about ecological cheese because so the reluctance is on that rather than on technology. So we have to be very careful not to go on the wrong fight. The other element which I find very interesting is why is there some difficulties between the humanitarian actors and the academia. I mean, on our side in Group UAD, we have tried many times. The thing is, the academic time perspective is 2 years, 3 years, a thesis. the perspective of the field actor is what kind of data, what kind of information I need now, or I think I will need in 2 months to make sure that I can do my job and I can avoid falling into traps. And we are doing a lot of operational research where we say we are like the lamp, the light of the car, just looking at the big holes on the track, so we can navigate. And we need sometimes operational research to identify what are those traps. The longer term research is much more looking at the horizon. It's not the same job, and we have been confronting research and say, well, sorry guys, your time frame, we don't like it. We think we cannot be scientific. And we told them that we are equally scientific than you. The thing is, we don't work under the same constraints, and we don't deliver the same type of thing to meet the specific needs. So I think this is one of the debates. How much can the academia understand that the needs of the aid actor is not a thesis in three years? That may be useful. I read a lot of books. I am very happy to find very interesting theses. I am dying to read Louis' thesis, but that will help me to think broader. That will not gear my approach.
Thanks. Our guest speakers, who wants to say something? Yes, go ahead.
I can, if I may. Okay.
Yes.
Me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for the discussion and for the questions. I think that our sector is changing. I mean, the Center for Humanitarian Data is really pushing very hard to increase the use and impact of data in humanitarian response. And a lot of data is becoming more available. Certainly, there is not a data set that fits all the needs. You know, you really, and we really encourage our users to look at the metadata to see what was the purpose of these data collections. So you really need to look, what was the main objective of this collection? Where was the sampling being applied? What was the methodology? So based on that, you can really take it on. So you cannot just find a data set and just use it for different purposes, as one of the colleagues on the floor was referring. So maybe it was meant to collect conflict in general, and then there are some instances of attacks on healthcare, so you cannot infer and maximize that information. So that is important to look at the metadata. The other thing that we observe in our sector is a lack of data literacy. So one of the participants on the floor was also saying, what is this relationship between universities and think tanks and the humanitarian sector? So we are doing more and more. For instance, the center very recently during the COVID-19 pandemic worked very closely with the Johns Hopkins University to build a model on how COVID will impact countries with humanitarian responses. So we are working more and more with academia, trying to build models, try to increase the interoperability of data sets and anticipate crises. And of course, I mean, there are a lot of models out there, and I will just bring a quote from this amazing statistician, George Box, that you may have heard about him. He's the creator of the box plots, but he said once that all models are wrong, some are useful. And that's completely true. You know, I mean, you can't really have the ideal data set with your model, but you know, some of them will give you some insights of what you want to do. So just keeping that in mind, that you always have to look at the caveats, the small letters that come on the data set. What is the validity of the data set when you do your analysis and your research? And maybe just addressing one point of competition that a colleague was referring to. We are in a sector that relies a lot on cooperation. So we really pushing together. I don't think any competition at all. Many organizations now are developing ways to share the data in a programmatically way. So whatever they produce, they share it with an API, maybe too technical, but a way that we can connect computers. And more, we are like living in an open environment of data sharing. So I don't think it's cooperation, it's competition, but rather cooperation. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Javier. I can see Christina's hand, but I know Bas was also raising it before. So maybe Bas, you go and then we go with you, Christina. Great.
Oh, okay, thanks. I'll be quick. There were some questions asked directly to me. So on the ethics of the Sahel pastoralist navigation program, so to say, I'm sure I don't know the details of this program. I wasn't involved in this program. I just know the folks who run it, and they've presented it a couple of times, some of the results. But of course, I think generally when you're leveraging data from fragile environments, from environments where you see vulnerable people, you have to be really careful. And this is sort of the ethical dimension. I think we all know, as practitioners also, we know that it's relevant, but it's still difficult to really incorporate that into the way of working. So I know OCHA is doing great work on this. When I was still at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, we worked closely with Leiden University, who are doing great stuff in this regard. So this maybe also links to the nexus between academics and practitioners. I recognize many of sort of the challenges that Francois shared with us, but I also see many sort of spaces where they do come together and work together in ministries, in NGOs, but also in sort of as data providers, right? So I know, for example, you have Arvid Egre, who is a renowned conflict researcher in Uppsala University, developing some great tools that I know are also being used by governments and others. ACLED has been mentioned a couple of times. This is actually the result of an academic project funded by the EU. So I think the nexus is there, and I think there are some challenges, but also some great examples of how it's going well. So on the conflict theory and linking that to data, I think that's an interesting one. And for me, as a civil servant, this was actually a frustrating one, because I never had the time to really invest in knowledge and to make sure that our sort of our systems, and for example, our early warning systems, were really aligned with up-to-date scientific knowledge on conflict theory. But at the same time, you see now that it is mainstreaming a little bit. And when I talk to clients, they are generally more and more aware of what's relevant. And for example, also making clear links, for example, between the sort of the argument of horizontal inequalities being key conflict drivers, creating grievances that in the end may evolve into armed conflicts, and also trying to link specific data sets to better measure the most relevant horizontal inequalities, for example. So there I see some work being done, but there's definitely more progress to be made from the practitioner's perspective. But also, I think from the scientific perspective, and this relates to one of the other questions that have been asked on data collection and gaps. So there I did some work on gender-sensitive conflict early warning. And there you see that the early warning systems being used show clear gaps in this regard, but also the scientific evidence base still is really thin, and not much or not enough research has been done on the links between all kinds of gender dynamics and violent conflicts. Whereas if you ask any practitioner, they will confirm that there are all kinds of relevant dynamics going on there in the field. And a short remark on markets and competition. Of course, there's always competition, and in a way that's good, because this pushes people to provide better products, right? But what saddens me sometimes is that I see open source, not-for-profit products such as the ACLED database or similar bases that are produced by universities and others are being used by private sector actors, repackaged, and then sold to clients for a lot of money. And I think that's really a harmful practice, because those not-for-profit and academic institutions are always struggling for funds. and they are doing an amazing job that we all profit from. So this is something that we really should cherish, and we should avoid that private sector actors are making profits over their backs.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vas. We are on time. I still want to give the floor to Christina, and also a minute later, if Emmanuel can also say final words. So, Christina, please.
Thank you. I'll try to be really short given the time. I just wanted to make one sort of last comment on the question of competitions between databases. And I agree that there's some really good examples there, ACLED, and I'm a really great fan of what HDX is doing. So I think there's some really good movements in the right direction. But to unfortunately end on a bit of a negative note, from a more detailed individual subject perspective, I think there's far too little sharing of data. And I sometimes wonder whether there are concerns about the scrutiny of the data. If people put it out there, it is always dressed up in a sense of we have to protect the security and privacy of those who provided the information, which is very true and needs to be addressed and has to be center stage. But I sometimes fear that we're hiding a little bit too much behind this. And as a result, there is too little sharing. And I think that actually impacts the quality of the data we can have access to. So yeah, thank you for this interesting discussion.
Thanks so much. Really good point as well. Emmanuel?
Yeah, very short. Thank you so much. Just to comment briefly of what Francois said about technology and reluctance to technology, and I completely agree. Actually, technology doesn't solve really the problem we're discussing this morning. I mean, satellites do not change their conversation. It's something very different because we're talking about something very political, actually. And the question of the evidence and the level of evidence is not really the point when the conversation becomes too political. And again, the comparison with COVID, which is, as we were told, somehow a war, can be made here, as well as the question of numeracy that somehow Louise mentioned, and at which we could say also a lot. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for this discussion.
Thanks so much. I want to give you the floor to close to Frederic, maybe.
Very briefly, thank you very much for all our panelists, and thank you all for managing this round table. And we keep in touch for our two projects, and have a good conference.
Thanks so much, Frederic. Thank you, everyone. Thanks again, everyone online. Or there, I don't know where you can see me.
So much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.